I do want to talk about this idea about the one like the Son of Man in Daniel 7, which is a major verse used, one of many verses, but a major verse used by these certain Jewish people when they were speculating about there being a second divine person next to God or operating within the realm of God. Okay, so let's read this verse, and then I want to get a little background context and then show what the Bible means when it speaks about these things, and evidence from the Bible where we see these themes repeated throughout it. Okay, and so Daniel 7 verse 9, and Daniel's having this apocalyptic vision. This is apocalyptic future vision. He's seeing something that's happened. And I also want to note that there's nothing in this text which inherently should tell us or teaches that the Son of Man is necessarily a divine person. This is something that I would argue has to be read into the text. Okay, and we'll look at a few things and why people believe that. But nonetheless, I don't believe there's anything that tells us that this person is a second divine person necessarily. Okay, Daniel 7:9, Daniel says, "As I continued to watch, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat." This Ancient of Days is obviously just one person. He's Yahweh. He's called the Ancient of Days because he is the one who is eternal. Okay, he's represented as having white hair and a beard, white beard, representing his wisdom. Okay, and then we go on in verses 13 and 14. "In my vision in the night, I continued to watch, and I saw one like the Son of Man, one who looked like a human being, coming with the clouds of heaven." Okay, and a lot of people get caught up on that phrase, coming with the clouds of heaven, and I want to look at this phrase and see if we can't understand a little better about what's going on here. Goes on to say, "And he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence," the Ancient of Days' presence, "and he was given dominion, glory, and kingship, that all the people of every nation and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." Okay, so a lot of scholars will point out, but a lot of people might not be aware of the background context or the cultural context of this particular idea, especially this idea about the rider of the clouds. Okay, and so we see in the Ugaritic Canaanite background, okay, that there is actually, it's a polytheistic religion, and we see that there is a supreme God. His name is El, and he's given the title the Father of Years. Now, this is obviously very similar to the Ancient of Days, and they both have the same meaning. Okay, but in the Ugaritic literature, there's a second God, and he's a lesser God. So there's two gods here, a greater God and a lesser God. And Baal is said to be the rider of the clouds because he is a rain god, and is a rain god in that he brings fertility. Okay, and we're going to see this here. Okay, and in the Baal cycle myth from Canaanite literature, Baal defeats the sea god Yam, and the word Yam in Hebrew and Aramaic means the sea. Okay, and essentially what's going on here is a battle between two different forces or types of water. Okay, you have Baal, who's the rider of the clouds because he's the god of rain. That's why he's called the rider of the clouds. He's the god of rain and fertility because rain brings life to things. But Yam, it represents the sea. He may be a personification of the sea, but he's presented in these myths as being a separate god. And so Yam represents the sea because it's chaotic and destructive. Okay, and so you have these two different types of water. You have one from Baal, who's the god of rain and fertility, and the Yam, who's the sea essentially, and it's wild and chaotic and destructive. And Baal actually defeats Yam, and El is hesitant, but he gives him this kingdom and things like this. And so this is not to say that Hebrew literature stole this myth or that it's exactly the same. In fact, I think it shows what is the consistent pattern that the Hebrew Bible will adopt these certain traditions and myths, and they will adapt them to glorify Yahweh and present things as they truly are. Okay, and so we see this idea about the sea and how it's chaotic. And we're going to see that in the Bible, the sea becomes symbolic for the forces or nations that are oppressive to God's people. These are chaotic forces which are outside of Israel, essentially, you could say. And we see this in Daniel 7. So we back up a few verses and we see this. It says, "In my vision, in the night I looked, and the four winds of heaven were churning up the great sea. Then four beasts, great beasts, came out of the sea." Now, obviously, this is symbolism of what we see here. The Bible does not have people fighting literal monsters in the sea. Okay, so the Hebrew people seem to take these ideas and again adopt them and adapt them to glorify the God of Israel. Okay, and we see this continued in Revelation. We see the same idea about the sea and it being defeated. Okay, and we see in Revelation 13:1, "Then I saw a beast with 10 great horns and 7 heads rising out of the sea." Again, here it's not a literal beast rising out of the sea. All of this is symbolism, and we're going to see how the Bible actually portrays this idea about God ruling through his king over the seas, his human king, explicitly. Let's read. In Revelation 21, it's interesting because it says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and earth had passed away, and the sea was no more." So the symbolism here is that in the new creation, in the new heaven and new earth, there will be no oppressive forces outside. It says the sea was no more. And so we have to understand the symbolism of how the Bible uses these various stories to glorify the God of Israel. And we see this, we're going to see here that yes, it is God who ultimately rules the sea, but we're going to see a explicit Psalm 89, where he does so through his human Messiah, who he identifies as David, which would obviously be a descendant of David, which would obviously be the Messiah. Okay, he says about God, "You rule the raging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them." And so here God's responding, and he says, "I have found my servant David. With my sacred oil I have anointed him. My hand will sustain him. I will set his hand over the sea and his right hand upon the rivers. He will call to me, 'You are my Father, my God, the rock of my salvation.' I will indeed appoint him," God speaking, "I will indeed appoint him as my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth." And so again here, this descendant of David is being appointed God's firstborn, who is the highest of the kings on the earth. And yes, it is God who rules the sea, but how does he do it? He says explicitly, "My servant David, my hand will sustain him. I will set his hand over the sea and his right hand upon the rivers." And so God is not ruling through a second God, not through a separate divine person, but rather a human person. Okay, so the Bible often takes these myths and uses them to glorify the God of Israel and show how God works through human beings.